What would you do if a simple flight to visit family turned into a nightmare that millions of people watched unfold online? Imagine sitting quietly in your assigned seat, whispering to your spouse about dinner plans, when suddenly uniformed officers arrive, demanding your ID, asking if you're carrying explosives, and treating you like a criminal. All of this in front of hundreds of passengers, all because of how you look. This is not just a story about a misunderstanding. It's about Ethan and Maya Parker, a young black couple who boarded a plane expecting nothing more than an ordinary journey. Instead, they were thrust into a storm of humiliation, suspicion, and viral outrage. A flight attendant's decision changed the course of their lives, igniting a national conversation about dignity, justice, and what it means to fly while black. But how did a quiet moment between two people escalate into a lawsuit that shook an entire airline industry? And how did the Parkers transform their pain into a legacy that would inspire thousands? Stay with us, because this is one story you will never forget. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and let's begin the journey together. The boarding process at LaGuardia Airport moved with the usual rhythm of a late afternoon departure. The line of passengers shuffled forward in fits and starts, the beeps of scanning boarding passes punctuating the air like small digital heartbeats. Rolling suitcases clattered against the tile. The soft hum of conversation rose and fell, blending with the announcements echoing from the overhead speakers. For most, it was just another day of travel. Ethan Parker adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on bag and glanced back at his wife. Maya. She was a step behind, her phone in hand, thumbs moving quickly as she replied to a text from her younger sister in Miami. Maya's dark curls framed her face, and her expression softened as she read her sister's excitement about the upcoming family reunion. Ethan smiled faintly. Even after years of marriage, he still noticed the little changes in her expressions, the warmth that spread when she thought about family. They reached the jet bridge and stepped into the narrow tunnel. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and recycled ventilation. Ethan instinctively rested a hand on Maya's shoulder, guiding her forward as the crowd slowed. He was always protective, not out of possessiveness, but from the quiet awareness that moving through the world together meant navigating invisible obstacles others rarely noticed. Maya leaned into his touch, understanding without words. Inside the cabin, the familiar hum of an idling aircraft wrapped around them. Overhead bins were filling fast. A flight attendant directed traffic with a rehearsed smile, while another helped an elderly woman lift her bag. Ethan spotted their row 12A and 12B on the left side of the aisle. He stowed his bag neatly above, slid into his seat, and adjusted his glasses. Maya tucked her purse beneath the seat in front of her before settling beside him. The seats felt snug, the blue fabric slightly worn from thousands of journeys. Ethan reached automatically for the safety card in the seat pocket. He wasn't nervous, but he always studied it, tracing the diagrams with a kind of ritual focus. Maya chuckled softly, shaking her head. "You've read that card on every flight we've ever taken," she whispered. "I could probably recite it by now." Ethan smiled, a little sheepishly. "I like to know the details. You never know what might matter." His voice was calm, almost absent-minded, as he scanned the tiny print. To him, the safety card was less about fear and more about control, an anchor in a space where control belonged mostly to others. Maya leaned closer, lowering her voice. "So, what's the plan once we land dinner straight at Mom's, or should we stop by the hotel first to drop our bags?" Her words were casual, but there was warmth in them. Family reunions meant laughter, food, long nights of stories. It was the kind of gathering that gave Maya energy, while for Ethan, it was more a quiet obligation, comforting but tiring. Still, he knew how much it mattered to her. "We'll see how traffic looks," he replied. "But I think your mom would never forgive us if we didn't show up first." He reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "Besides, I want to see how much your nephew has grown since Christmas. He's probably taller than me now." Maya laughed softly, the sound blending with the shuffle of boarding passengers. "Don't say that. You'll ruin his ego. He already thinks he's a grown man at 12. For a few minutes, the conversation drifted between dinner plans, whether they should rent a car, and the kind of small details that make ordinary life feel stable. Ethan leaned back, exhaling, letting himself relax. For once, he hoped this flight would just be a flight uneventful, quiet, the kind of trip that disappeared into memory without fuss. But as they spoke, a pair of eyes lingered on them from farther down the cabin. Claire Mitchell, a senior flight attendant with more than a decade of service, stood by the galley door, watching as passengers filtered to their seats. Her expression was unreadable, her arms folded neatly behind her back in a posture that blended professionalism with vigilance. She was trained to notice details, to scan the room for anything unusual. Over the years, she had come to trust her instincts, even when they were based on little more than a flicker of unease. Now, her gaze rested on Ethan and Maya. She noticed the way they leaned in close, whispering. She saw Ethan studying the safety card longer than most. Something about it prickled at her nerves. She told herself it was nothing, yet she couldn't shake the feeling. She had seen things before, strange behaviors, people who didn't fit the expected pattern. Sometimes she was wrong, but sometimes, she reminded herself, being cautious made all the difference. She chewed lightly on the inside of her cheek, a private habit when she felt conflicted. Her stomach tightened as she glanced again at the couple. They looked ordinary enough, business casual clothes, calm demeanor, but that, she thought, was exactly what made her uneasy. Too ordinary, too composed. She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her like static. Meanwhile, Ethan adjusted his glasses again, unaware of the eyes fixed on him. He leaned closer to Maya. "I'm glad we're doing this," he murmured. "We've both been working too much. Maybe a weekend with family is exactly what we need." Maya nodded, resting her hand on his arm. "I just want you to relax. No deadlines, no numbers, no analyzing safety cards." She smiled, teasing, but her eyes softened with affection. He chuckled quietly, folding the card and sliding it back into the pocket. "Fine, but only because you asked." The line of passengers thinned as the final few boarded. The cabin door remained open, voices drifting in from the jet bridge. Ethan settled into his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment, letting the low drone of conversation soothe him. He thought about Miami sunshine, his in-laws cooking, the sound of waves hitting the shore. For a moment, everything felt right. Maya scrolled through her phone one last time before airplane mode, her sister's messages filling the screen. "Can't wait to see you guys. Bring Ethan's famous jokes." Maya smiled, shaking her head. Ethan wasn't much of a joke teller, but her family adored him anyway. He had a quiet strength, a way of listening that made people feel seen. It was part of why she fell in love with him. Neither of them noticed the faint tension building across the cabin. Claire Mitchell continued to watch, her mind caught between logic and instinct. She shifted her weight, debating silently. Should she say something? Should she let it go? The decision hovered in her chest like a storm cloud waiting to break. And as the final chime announced the closing of the cabin door, Ethan reached for Maya's hand once more. She squeezed back, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. He thought it was just another flight. He had no idea that within minutes, the course of their journey and their lives would change. Claire Mitchell stood by the forward galley, her hands clasped loosely in front of her waist, trying to focus on the last-minute task that came with every flight. But her eyes kept drifting back to row 12. She had spent more than a decade in uniform, crossing the country countless times, dealing with every type of passenger imaginable. She had dealt with drunk travelers who couldn't stand, with frightened children who clung to her hand, with irritable executives who believed the aisle was their kingdom. Through it all, she had learned to trust the small alarms that sometimes went off in her mind. They weren't always right, but they were rarely completely wrong. Now, as she studied the couple seated by the window and middle seat, she felt that alarm again. The man, tall and reserved, adjusted his glasses and studied the laminated safety card like it was a blueprint. His wife leaned close, whispering. Their expressions were calm, almost too calm. Claire couldn't explain it, but something about them seemed rehearsed, like actors playing a part. The thought made her uneasy. She shifted her weight, chewing the inside of her cheek. She told herself it was ridiculous. They looked like any other pair of travelers. Business casual, small carry-ons, polite mannerisms. Yet the unease in her chest refused to dissolve. She had been wrong before, but she had also been right. She remembered a time 5 years earlier when she had noticed a passenger lingering near the lavatory too long, fidgeting nervously. She reported it. Security found prohibited items in his bag. The captain had commended her for vigilance. Ever since, Claire believed that ignoring instinct was dangerous. Still, she knew how fragile perception could be. The airline had drilled it into their training modules: treat every passenger with dignity. Avoid assumptions. Don't single anyone out without cause. She had clicked through those slides dozens of times, but training modules didn't change the fact that her stomach tightened when her eyes lingered on row 12. She caught herself staring and quickly shifted her gaze as another attendant passed by. She didn't want to appear distracted. The boarding door closed with a dull thud. The sound carried through the cabin, signaling that the last chance to act was passing. Claire inhaled sharply, her chest constricting. What if she was right? What if something happened and she had noticed but said nothing? She imagined the questions afterward, the faces on the evening news, the scathing headlines. Flight attendant ignored suspicious behavior. She felt a rush of anxiety at the thought. Her entire career could be destroyed not by what she did, but by what she failed to do. She glanced at the captain's closed cockpit door, then at the gate agent preparing to walk away. Her heart raced. Maybe she should just mention it. Not an accusation, just a caution. She would feel better if someone else knew. She stepped forward quickly before the agent left. "Hey," she said in a low voice, "can I talk to you for a second?" Her tone was hushed, urgent, but careful. The agent paused, looking tired from the long boarding process. He had a headset slung around his neck and a tablet tucked under his arm. "Yeah. What's up?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Claire glanced over her shoulder subtly, tilting her head toward row 12. The couple, window and middle, man with glasses, woman in black sweater. Something feels off. The agent frowned, off like how Claire hesitated. She could hear the thinness of her reasoning even as she thought about it. The way they're whispering. The way he keeps looking at the safety instructions like he's memorizing them. I've worked flights long enough to know when something doesn't sit right. The agent shifted his weight, unimpressed. That's it. Whispering and reading the safety card, I know how it sounds, Claire said quickly. But I've had this feeling before. Sometimes you just know. The agent looked at her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. Do you want me to call security? The words hit her like a heavy stone. Did she? She knew the implications. Passengers would notice. It could disrupt the flight, embarrass people who were doing nothing wrong. And yet, the image of her ignoring her instincts gnawed at her. Better safe than sorry, she thought. She swallowed and nodded. Yeah, just to be sure. The agent's expression tightened. He tapped his tablet, muttering into his headset. Claire's pulse quickened. She glanced again at row 12. The man now leaned back, eyes closed, one hand resting on his wife's. They looked ordinary. They looked peaceful. And yet, Claire's chest still felt tight, as if her body knew something her mind couldn't articulate. She returned to the galley, trying to steady her breathing. Another attendant, a younger woman named Alicia, gave her a curious look. Everything okay? Fine, Claire replied too quickly. Just making sure everything's in order. Alicia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Claire leaned against the counter, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles whitened. She tried to convince herself she had done the right thing, that she was protecting everyone on board. But beneath that rationalization, a small voice whispered doubts. What if she was wrong? What if this was nothing more than her imagination, sharpened by years of overthinking? She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. She had made her choice. There was no taking it back. 7 minutes later, the cabin fell into a hush as 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the aircraft. The air shifted instantly, like oxygen had been sucked out. Passengers turned in their seats, whispering. Phones slipped discreetly into hands. Claire's heart pounded as she watched the officers move down the aisle. She knew exactly where they were headed. They stopped at row 12. The lead officer, broad-shouldered with a stern expression, fixed his eyes on Ethan and Maya. Sir, ma'am, he said firmly, I need to see your IDs. Claire's stomach twisted. This was the moment she had set in motion. She folded her arms, her eyes fixed on the couple. The man blinked in confusion. Excuse me, identification, please, the officer repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The woman frowned. What's going on? Passengers leaned closer, straining to hear. Whispered voices rippled down the aisle. Claire could feel the judgment radiating from every direction. She had made the call, and now the spotlight was on her. The man slowly reached for his wallet, his hand trembling slightly. He handed over his driver's license. His wife did the same. The officers studied them, then exchanged a glance. Are you traveling alone? Yes, the man replied, his jaw tightening. Where are you headed? Miami, the woman said sharply. Her arms folded across her chest. What's the purpose of your trip? The officer pressed. Visiting family, the man answered, his voice clipped with rising frustration. What is this about? The officer ignored the question. Did you check any luggage? Yes. 1 bag each, the woman said, her voice shaking now. The murmurs grew louder. Phones were raised higher. Claire's chest constricted as she realized just how visible this had become. Then she noticed a young man across the aisle, his phone held high, the red recording light glowing. She recognized him as Jordan Lee, a frequent traveler known to stir up conversations online. Her pulse raced. If this video spread, there would be no containing it. The officer leaned in closer. "Do you have any explosives or dangerous materials in your possession?" The woman gasped audibly. The man's fists clenched. "Are you serious right now? I need you to stay calm," the officer said sharply. "I am calm," the man shot back, his voice tight. "You're the one standing over me like I did something wrong." Claire's throat felt dry. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. She had started this chain of events, and now she was trapped inside it. The faces of passengers turned toward her, subtle glances filled with accusation. Her hands trembled at her sides. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake too big to undo. The officer's presence still lingered in the cabin air even after they returned the IDs. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, murmurs buzzing like static. Some turned back to their magazines or phones, trying to pretend the moment hadn't happened. But the tension remained. It clung to the space between the rows, thick and heavy, impossible to brush away. Ethan Parker sat rigidly, his jaw tight, his pulse hammering against his throat. His hand still rested against his thigh, where he had clenched it into a fist, leaving faint crescents from his nails. Maya Parker sat beside him, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her breathing uneven. She stared at the window, her reflection fractured by the glass. The humiliation settled over both of them like an unwelcome weight. Across the aisle. Jordan Lee lowered his phone slightly, but didn't stop recording. His instincts told him this was only the beginning. He had seen moments like this spiral into something much bigger. A misplaced accusation. An innocent person treated as if they were dangerous. The internet would eat this up, yes, but beyond that, there was power in truth when it was captured on camera. He stayed silent, letting his lens do the speaking. At the front of the plane, Claire Mitchell stood frozen in the galley. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears, a dull thud, thud, thud that drowned out the rustle of snack bags and the hum of engines. She had done what she thought was right. She had whispered her concerns to the gate agent, nudged him toward caution. Now the consequences were spilling into the open for everyone to see. She thought of the training modules again, the slides with cheerful stock photos of diverse passengers smiling. The scripted reminders bias can cloud judgment. Always ensure your concerns are based on objective behavior. Objective. That word replayed in her head, cruel and sharp. Was whispering to one's spouse and reading a safety card objective grounds for suspicion? Even as she asked herself the question, she knew the answer, but it was too late to take it back. The lead officer, satisfied for the moment, stepped back. "You're clear," he muttered. No apology, no acknowledgement of the embarrassment he had caused. He simply turned, motioned to his partner, and began walking toward the exit. The ripple of whispers swelled. Phones tilted to capture their retreat. Maya turned her gaze toward the aisle, and, for a fleeting second, her eyes locked with Claire's. There was no mistaking the heat in that stare, anger mixed with disbelief. Claire quickly looked away, her cheeks burning. The weight of judgment was now pointed at her. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened." His tone carried no hint of what he had been told in the cockpit only moments earlier. The incident had already reached his ears, and he was not pleased. Back in row 12, Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He kept his voice low, but the tension threaded through every word. Why us out of everyone on this plane? Why us? Maya closed her eyes briefly. You know why. The silence between them said everything. This wasn't new. This wasn't the first time they had been singled out in public spaces, asked to explain themselves, made to prove they belonged. But this time, it was louder, more public. Hundreds of eyes had seen it. Phones had recorded it. Their dignity had been placed on trial in front of strangers. Claire tried to steady herself. She moved toward the cockpit, every step heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she hesitated, then knocked lightly. The first officer opened it a crack, his expression guarded. "Captain wants to see you." Inside. The cockpit hummed with the soft glow of instruments. Captain William Harris sat in the left seat, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on a tablet resting against the console. Claire's heart sank when she saw the screen. It was already playing back footage, grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. Ethan's voice tight with anger. Maya's gasp. The officer's clipped questions. And Claire, visible in the background, watching from the galley. The captain paused the video and turned toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. What the hell was that? Claire swallowed hard. I had a feeling. Captain. Something about them seemed off. I thought it was safer. To a feeling, Harris cut her off, his voice low but sharp. Did they break any rules? Did they do anything that justified being singled out like that? They were whispering, and he kept studying the safety card, Claire said, her voice faltering as she heard the words aloud. They sounded flimsy, even to her. Harris's jaw tightened, whispering to his wife and reading a safety card. That's your evidence. Claire's throat felt dry. I was trying to protect the passengers. We're told to be vigilant. You're told to use judgment, Harris snapped. And this isn't the first time. Is it? Her stomach dropped. Well, what do you mean I just got a message from corporate? There have been other complaints. Other times you've reported passengers, black passengers, specifically without justification. He leaned forward, his voice like a blade. Is that true? Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't find the courage. The captain's eyes stayed locked on hers, unwavering. The company can't afford this kind of scandal, he said finally, and I won't allow my flight to be the center of a profiling controversy. When we land, you're off this flight, effective immediately. The words slammed into her like a physical blow. Her knees felt weak. Captain, please, I was just trying to— Enough, Harris said sharply. You've done enough. He turned back to his instruments, signaling the conversation was over. Claire stood frozen for a moment before the first officer gestured for her to leave. She stepped back into the galley, her world spinning. For the first time, she realized she might have destroyed her career with a whisper. Back in row 12, Ethan and Maya sat in silence. The murmurs had finally begun to die down, but the humiliation still clung to them. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to steady his breathing. Maya stared out the window, blinking back tears she didn't want anyone to see. Neither reached for the other's hand this time. The space between them felt heavier than ever. Jordan Lee, still recording, caught every detail: the couple's quiet pain, the other passengers' uneasy stares, the way no one had offered comfort. He knew this video would matter. He knew people would see themselves in it, would feel the sting of being treated like a suspect for simply existing. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow, The world is going to see this. At that very moment, the world already had. By the time the aircraft taxied away from the gate, Jordan's video had been uploaded. Within 4 minutes, it had 10,000 views. By the time the wheels left the ground, it had reached 1 million. Claire didn't know it yet, but the whisper she had given to the gate agent was no longer just a quiet caution. It had become a storm spreading far beyond the cabin walls, and it was about to consume everything in its path. The hush in the cabin was like nothing Ethan Parker had ever felt before, not even in courtrooms, not in the tense silence before a financial deal closed, not in the pauses of family arguments that stretched too long. This was different. It was suffocating. The 2 security officers stood planted in the narrow aisle, uniforms sharp against the soft blue of the cabin seats. Their presence shifted the air itself, pulling everyone's focus like gravity, every pair of eyes locked on row 12. Maya sat upright, her pulse thrumming so loudly in her ears it nearly drowned out the sound of the engines. She felt the heat of stairs on her skin, like 100 invisible spotlights. Her hands curled into fists in her lap, nails digging into her palms. She turned to Ethan, but his gaze was fixed on the officers, his expression taut, composed, but beneath it she could feel the simmering anger he was trying to hold down. Identification, the lead officer repeated. Ethan handed over his license with a steady hand. Though his chest felt like it was caving in, Maya followed, her fingers brushing his as she passed hers forward. The officer examined them, glanced at his partner, then returned his gaze to Ethan. "You traveling alone?" Ethan's voice was clipped. "Yes." "Destination Miami," Maya interjected, her tone sharp. "What's the purpose of your trip family visit?" Ethan said, exhaling through his nose, every syllable tight. "What is this about?" The officer ignored the question. "Any checked bags?" "Yes," Maya said, "1 each." A murmur rippled through the cabin. The sound of phones lifting filled the silence clicks of record buttons, faint vibrations as cameras focused. Across the aisle, Jordan Lee steadied his phone, the little red light glowing steadily. He zoomed closer on Ethan's face, catching the controlled fury in his eyes. The second officer cleared his throat. "Do you have any explosives or dangerous materials on you?" Maya's jaw dropped. What Ethan's hands tightened against his knees. "Are you serious right now, sir? I need you to remain calm." "I am calm," Ethan snapped, his voice low but shaking with restraint. "You're the one standing over me like I've done something wrong." Maya leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Why are we being questioned? We're sitting in our assigned seats, minding our business. Why us? Why only us?" The lead officer shifted, his jaw hardening, but he didn't answer. He handed back their IDs with a curt nod. "You're clear." Just like that. They turned and walked back up the aisle, but the damage was permanent. The silence they left behind was thick with judgment. Ethan sat back slowly, his pulse pounding, his breaths uneven. He looked around at the faces turned toward him, some sympathetic, others skeptical, all watching. He hated the way they looked at him, as though he were still under suspicion, as though innocence wasn't enough to erase the stain. Maya folded her arms across her chest, pressing herself into the seat. Her cheeks burned. Humiliation washed over her in waves. She wanted to vanish, to disappear into the cracks of the seat, to escape the gaze of strangers who saw her not as Maya Parker, daughter, sister, wife, but as something dangerous. Claire Mitchell watched from the galley, her stomach in knots. She had asked for this. She had whispered her doubts. And now here it was, out in the open. The officer's questions, the passenger's stares, The phones raised like silent judges. She could already imagine the headlines if this went public. She told herself she had only followed her instincts, that she had wanted safety. But watching the couple's faces, she felt a pang of doubt she couldn't suppress. Jordan lowered his phone for a moment, exhaling. He could feel the heat of the story buzzing in his chest. This wasn't just another travel inconvenience. This was profiling, laid bare in the middle of a crowded plane. He thought of his own childhood. The times he had seen his father stop for no reason. His mother questioned in stores as though she didn't belong. He thought of how invisible pain becomes visible when captured on camera. He whispered to himself, "The world is going to see this." And with one tap, the upload began. Back in row 12, Maya leaned close to Ethan, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe this." Ethan kept his eyes forward. "Believe it." His voice was steady, but inside he was unraveling. He thought of all the times he had been told to keep calm, to not overreact, to make himself small so others would feel safe. He thought of how exhausting it was to live that way, to constantly measure his tone, his gestures, even the space he occupied. And now, in front of hundreds of people, he had been forced to perform his innocence once again. The engines rumbled louder as the plane taxied from the gate. The captain's voice returned, smooth and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Maya shut her eyes. The humiliation hadn't faded, and she knew it wouldn't. Even when the officers had walked away, their questions still echoed in her ears. She could still feel the sting of being treated like a suspect. She reached for Ethan's hand, needing something steady, but he hesitated before lacing his fingers with hers. Claire caught the moment from where she stood. Her chest tightened. She told herself again that she had been protecting the passengers, but the words sounded hollow, even inside her own mind. She turned away, gripping the galley counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The wheels lifted off the ground, and the plane climbed into the sky. But for Ethan and Maya, the cabin no longer felt like a vessel of safety. It felt like a cage. Every glance from another passenger reinforced that invisible mark, that sense that suspicion had been carved into their skin. Minutes passed in silence. Ethan stared at the seat back in front of him, thoughts churning. He imagined the headlines, the whispers that would follow them into the terminal, the way this moment would be replayed again and again in his mind. He wanted to believe it would end once the plane landed, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Across the aisle. Jordan checked his phone. The video had already spread like wildfire. Notifications stacked one on top of another. 10,000 views, 50,000, 100,000. Comments poured in, outrage spilling across timelines. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the video had surpassed 1 million. The storm was already raging outside the cabin, and no one on board knew how far it would reach. Claire shifted uneasily, her phone buzzing in her pocket with notifications from colleagues and friends. She didn't dare look. She knew what it would say. Her whisper to authority, her decision made in a flicker of doubt, had grown into something bigger than she could control. Maya leaned against Ethan's shoulder at last, her eyes stinging. "Why does it always have to be us?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His throat ached with the weight of all the times he had asked himself the same question. Finally, he whispered back, "Because some people still don't see us for who we are, only what they fear." Maya closed her eyes. She wanted to believe things would change, that truth and justice would prevail. But for now, All she felt was the ache of being singled out for simply existing. The cabin lights dimmed. The hum of engines filled the silence. But inside row 12, nothing felt quiet. Jordan Lee sat with his phone angled low, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. He had been recording long enough to know when a video had power, when an image could pierce through the noise of a million posts and stop people in their tracks. This was one of those moments. The way Ethan Parker's jaw clenched as he handed over his license. The tremor in Maya's voice when she asked why only they had been stopped. The silence of the other passengers, watching but doing nothing. The plane had just reached cruising altitude when Jordan's phone buzzed violently with notifications. He glanced down and saw the numbers skyrocketing. 10,000 views, 50,000, 100,000. By the time the seatbelt light dimmed, his video had crossed 1 million. His heart thudded with a strange mix of adrenaline and dread. He knew the clip would go viral, but he hadn't expected it to move this fast. Across the aisle. Ethan leaned back, his hands pressed against his thighs as if holding himself together. He was silent, but Maya could feel the storm inside him. She reached for his hand again, and this time he let her take it, his grip tight. She whispered, "People saw. They all saw." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, but what will they do about it?" For him, the humiliation was still fresh, still heavy in his chest. He could still feel the officer's voice echoing in his ears, still see the way passengers' eyes had narrowed. He knew that once the moment passed, most of those witnesses would return to their routines. But maybe, just maybe, the video would do what silence could not. At the front of the cabin, Claire Mitchell shifted restlessly in the galley. She could feel the atmosphere had changed. The looks her fellow crew members gave her were colder now, more distant. One attendant avoided eye contact altogether, brushing past her with pursed lips. Another gave her a look that needed no words. Judgment. Claire's phone buzzed against her hip. She pulled it out, her pulse quickening. A message from a friend blinked on the screen. "Is this you?" Attached was a screenshot of the video, her face captured just behind the officers. Her stomach dropped. She scrolled quickly, seeing her name tagged in dozens of posts. Some passengers had already identified her. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, her breathing shallow. She told herself she had been doing her job, following her instincts. But the image on the screen replayed in her mind Maya's face tight with disbelief. Ethan's voice steady but wounded. Claire's throat tightened. For the first time, she wondered if instinct wasn't the defense she thought it was, but the accusation. Captain William Harris had just received the same video in the cockpit. A message from corporate pinged on his tablet, accompanied by a link already racking up millions of views. His expression hardened as he read the subject line, "Potential PR Crisis, Flight 207. He had seen crises before, but this one was different. This wasn't turbulence or mechanical trouble. This was human failure, and it was unraveling in real time. Back in row 12. Maya pulled out her own phone once the Wi-Fi stabilized. Notifications cascaded across her screen like a flood. Messages from her sister, from friends, from coworkers. Her sister's text read, "Danny, is that you? Are you okay?" Tears blurred Maya's vision. She typed back with shaky fingers, "We're fine, just tired. I'll call when we land." Ethan leaned over to glance at her phone, then pulled his own from his pocket. His notifications were relentless. Mentions on Twitter, friends tagging him in the video. His hands shook as he scrolled. Every comment burned into him. Disgusting. How can this still happen in 2025? Fire that flight attendant immediately. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had always tried to move quietly through the world, to avoid drawing too much attention. Now, the world's eyes were on him whether he wanted them or not. Jordan checked the numbers again. 2 million. He adjusted the caption to drive the point home. This black couple was humiliated for nothing but existing. Flying while black is not a crime. The likes and shares surged. Influencers reposted it. Journalists reached out. He had lit a match in a room full of dry kindling. Meanwhile, Claire's legs felt heavy as she stood in the galley. She heard whispers behind her from her fellow crew. But they weren't the casual chatter of teammates anymore. They were sharp, clipped, filled with disdain. She pretended not to hear, straightening napkins that didn't need straightening. Her thoughts spiraled. Was her career ending right here? At 38,000 feet, Maya leaned into Ethan's shoulder, her voice soft. This isn't just about us anymore. Is it? Ethan shook his head. No, it never was. He thought of his parents, of the conversations they'd had with him growing up. Warnings dressed as advice. Keep your hands visible. Speak calmly. Never give them a reason. And still, here he was, treated like a threat while doing nothing at all. He felt the sting of it deep in his bones. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. Resolve. At 37,000 feet, the cabin looked calm. Passengers sipped sodas, flipped through magazines, adjusted blankets. But online, a storm raged. Major news outlets picked up Jordan's video within an hour. The headline crawled across the bottom of televisions in airports and living rooms across the country. Flight attendants call. Leads to racial profiling on Flight 287. In the cockpit, Captain Harris's phone buzzed with another message from corporate. Expect media on arrival. Prepare statement. His jaw clenched. He hated this. Flying was supposed to be about trust, about safety, about delivering people to their destinations with dignity. Now his crew's actions had shattered that trust. He knew there would be consequences, not only for the attendant who started it, but for the airline itself. Claire finally pulled her phone out again. Her inbox was already flooded. A message from her husband. Call me. Now. Another from her supervisor. We need to talk when you land. She wanted to throw the device away, to escape the digital tidal wave swallowing her, but she couldn't. Her whole body trembled as she set it face down on the counter. Ethan glanced around the cabin. He could feel the eyes of strangers still flicking toward him, some sympathetic, some avoiding his gaze entirely. He wondered what they saw when they looked at him. A man, a husband, a professional, or just the caricature that suspicion painted. Maya squeezed his hand again. We'll get through this, she whispered, though her voice shook. He turned to her, his eyes softening. We always do, but deep down, Ethan knew this was different. This wasn't just about surviving humiliation. This was about challenging it, about deciding whether to let it pass like all the other moments before or to finally say enough. Jordan checked his phone one more time. 5 million views. The comments had shifted from shock to fury. Calls for accountability, for justice, for change. He leaned back in his seat, his heart racing. For years he had chased moments like this, but this one felt heavier, more personal. He had seen too many stories fade after a day of outrage. He vowed he would not let this one fade. Far below the aircraft, cities glittered in the night. Screens in apartments, bars, airports, and dorm rooms flickered with the same video. Ethan's calm but furious voice, Maya's incredulous protest, officers looming above them, and Claire's face, caught in the background, unblinking. The storm had ignited, and there was no turning back. The cabin lights glowed dimly as the flight leveled out above the clouds. But for Ethan and Maya Parker, there was no comfort in the soft ambiance. The incident had shaken them to their core, and though the officers had walked away, the shame clung like smoke that refused to dissipate. Ethan sat upright, staring at the tray table folded against the seat in front of him. His mind churned, replaying the questions that had been hurled at him. Do you have explosives? Are you traveling alone? His jaw tightened again as if bracing for another blow. He felt stripped bare, dignity peeled away in public view. Maya sat close, her fingers nervously tapping against her armrest. Every now and then, she stole glances at him, trying to read his silence. Behind them, passengers whispered, trading interpretations as if they were commentators on a televised game. Some shook their heads with quiet disapproval. Others muttered words that carried the stench of doubt. Each whisper pressed down on the Parkers, making their seats feel smaller, more confining. Claire Mitchell stood rigid in the galley, her thoughts racing faster than the aircraft itself. She tried to focus on tasks, checking supplies, folding napkins, adjusting coffee packets. But nothing could silence the pounding in her ears. Every crew member's glance felt like a verdict. She wanted to defend herself, to shout that she had only been following her instincts. But even she no longer believed the words would hold weight. In the cockpit, Captain William Harris scrolled through the flurry of messages from corporate headquarters. Words like containment, statement, and investigation flashed across his screen. A single sentence stood out. Media has picked up viral video. Prepare response immediately. He rubbed his temple, letting out a low sigh. He had been a pilot for nearly 3 decades, had weathered storms, emergencies, and near disasters. But this was different. This was a storm not of nature or mechanics, but of humanity failing in plain sight. Below, on the ground. That storm raged. News outlets scrambled to cover the story as Jordan Lee's video spread like wildfire. On Twitter, hashtags blazed across trending lists. Flying while black. Justice for the Parkers. Airline accountability. Cable news cut into scheduled programming to air the clip. In living rooms across the country, families watched Ethan's measured anger, Maya's disbelief, and the officer's heavy presence. Claire's face lingered in the corner of the frame, frozen in judgment. At Airway International's corporate headquarters in Dallas, a crisis team gathered in a glass-walled conference room. Executives huddled around a long mahogany table, their expressions grim. Screens mounted on the walls played the video in an endless loop. Ethan's voice filled the room again and again. You're the one standing over me, like I've done something wrong. A senior communications officer broke the silence. We need a statement now. This is spiraling faster than anything we've seen. Millions of views in under 2 hours. The head of HR adjusted her glasses. This isn't just about a bad decision. We've had prior complaints about Claire Mitchell. I warned leadership months ago. Those were ignored. The room shifted uncomfortably. The CEO, a tall man with gray temples and a face carved by years of boardroom battles, exhaled sharply. If those records surface, we'll be accused of systemic negligence. They already have surfaced, the HR officer said quietly. She slid a printed document across the table. Anonymous employees are leaking information. At least 5 previous incidents, all involving black passengers. A hush fell over the room. The CEO picked up the paper, his knuckles whitening as he read. He slammed it back onto the table. We're not just fighting PR. We're fighting for survival. If we mishandle this, we could be looking at lawsuits that will drain us for years. In row 12, Ethan turned to Maya. "It's everywhere already," he murmured, holding up his phone. Notifications flooded his screen. Articles, mentions, strangers reaching out with both support and venom. His face looked pale in the glow of the screen. Maya leaned closer. "Then maybe that's good. Maybe people will finally see." He shook his head, conflicted. "See what? That we got humiliated in front of everyone. That we had to prove we weren't criminals, just to sit in our seats. I'm tired of being the example." "Maya." His voice cracked on the last word. She squeezed his hand tightly. "You're not just the example. You're the truth. People need to see the truth." The plane hummed steadily as it cut through the night sky. But below, corporate phones buzzed with urgency. Legal teams drafted potential responses. Communications officers debated language. We do not condone racial profiling. We value diversity and inclusion, empty phrases that had been used too many times before. They knew it. The public would know it too. Jordan refreshed his feed again. The numbers surged past 10 million. Influential voices had joined the chorus. Civil rights leaders, celebrities, ordinary travelers. The collective outrage was unmistakable. He glanced across the aisle at Ethan and Maya. They sat quietly, their shoulders heavy, but Jordan saw something else in them: resilience. He knew this was more than a viral moment. It was a mirror held up to a nation. Claire leaned against the galley counter, her phone buzzing relentlessly. She finally lifted it, dreading what she would see. Dozens of messages. Friends asking if it was true. Strangers hurling insults. News outlets requesting comment. Her husband's text sat at the top. "This doesn't look good. Claire, call me now." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to vanish, to be anywhere but here. The cabin door to the cockpit opened, and the first officer stepped into the galley. His face was grim. "Captain wants you," he said quietly. Claire followed, her legs heavy. Inside, Harris didn't look up from the tablet. He played the video again, the sound tinny but unmistakable. Ethan's anger, Maya's protest, Claire's face hovering in the background. Harris finally looked up, his eyes piercing. "This is out of our hands now. Corporate has been flooded with complaints. Reporters are waiting in Atlanta. They're already calling for your termination." Claire's breath caught. "Captain, please. I was trying to protect." "Stop." Harris's voice was sharp. "Do you understand what you've done? This wasn't vigilance. This was profiling. And now the airline is on fire." Tears stung Claire's eyes, but she forced them back. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words tangled in her throat. Harris's gaze didn't waver. "When we land, you're off this flight. Effective immediately." She stood frozen, her world tilting beneath her. She left the cockpit without another word, returning to the galley, where her colleagues avoided her eyes. For the first time in her career, she felt utterly alone. Maya shifted in her seat, glancing around the cabin. The murmurs had quieted, but the tension was still there. She thought of her parents waiting in Miami, the family gathering they had been excited about. She wondered how she would tell them what had happened, how she could explain the weight of humiliation that still pressed down on her. Ethan looked out the window at the endless dark sky. His reflection stared back at him, weary but unbroken. Deep down, he knew this moment wasn't just theirs anymore. The world was watching, and the airline was scrambling. Something had been set into motion that couldn't be undone. Far below, in the Dallas boardroom, the CEO rubbed his temples, his voice low and heavy. We can't contain this. The only way forward is accountability. Terminate Claire Mitchell, launch a full investigation, and prepare for litigation. We'll have to face this head-on. The room nodded grimly. Outside the walls of that conference room, the world had already decided. The Parkers were no longer just passengers. They were symbols. And Airway International was no longer just an airline. It was the battleground for a fight that had been simmering for far too long. By the time Flight 287 cut through the night sky over Georgia, the world below had already shifted. On television screens, in airports, and across millions of phones, the video played on a loop. Ethan Parker's calm voice pressed against the weight of humiliation. Maya Parker's outrage pierced through the cabin air. The officers' clipped tones hovered like a verdict. And behind them all, Claire Mitchell's face, stiff and unblinking, hovered in judgment. In the cabin, the Parkers tried to pretend the world wasn't watching them. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the safety card he had once studied out of habit, though the words blurred before him now. Maya scrolled through her phone, each swipe revealing another wave of support and condemnation. Messages from family filled her inbox, begging to know if they were safe, telling her they were proud, warning her to brace for the storm. Across the aisle, Jordan Lee monitored the numbers with a steady pulse of adrenaline. The clip had surpassed 20 million views. Hashtags roared across every platform. News anchors were already debating the incident as though it had happened years ago, though the Parkers were still strapped into their seats thousands of feet in the air. In a studio in New York, the clip played behind a round table of commentators. One anchor adjusted her papers and spoke gravely. What we are witnessing here is yet another example of racial profiling in public spaces. A black couple, seated quietly, treated as potential threats with no evidence. The question is, how much longer can airlines claim these are isolated incidents? A guest analyst shook his head. The airline will issue a statement, fire the attendant, and promise training. But without systemic accountability, this cycle will repeat. We've seen it before. The conversation echoed across networks. Some commentators called it disgraceful, demanding immediate reform. Others downplayed it as overreaction, questioning whether viewers really knew the full story. In homes across the country, families argued at kitchen tables, voices rising over the same footage, the same questions. Back inside the aircraft, Ethan felt the vibration of his phone against his palm. A message from his boss blinked across the screen. Saw the video. Call me when you land. His stomach sank. He imagined the whispers already circulating through his workplace, colleagues dissecting his every word, wondering if he had been too angry or not calm enough. He could feel the familiar weight of judgment pressing down, one that followed him in every professional space. Maya noticed his expression and touched his arm gently. Don't read it now. Please. He nodded, sliding the phone back into his pocket. He leaned his head against the seat, closing his eyes. But rest didn't come. Instead came memory. The time he had been pulled over on his way to a client meeting, asked to step out of his car because he fit a description. The job interview where an executive mistook him for support staff. The way neighbors eyed him suspiciously when he jogged through his own neighborhood. And now this, in front of hundreds of strangers, recorded and immortalized for the world. Maya rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes stinging. She thought of her parents, of the conversations they had tried to shield her from growing up. But the truth was unavoidable now. It was here, in the air, magnified by millions. In the galley, Claire Mitchell clutched a cup of water she had no intention of drinking. Her phone buzzed nonstop with messages she refused to open. The crew avoided her, passing by with stiff movements. Even passengers a few rows back glanced her way with something colder than curiosity. She told herself she would explain, that people would understand she had been trying to do her job. But deep inside, a small voice whispered that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. In Dallas, the airline's PR team worked through the night. Draft statements covered conference room tables, filled with words that felt hollow. We do not condone discrimination. We take these matters seriously. Each draft was discarded. The world was demanding more than platitudes. The HR director leaned forward, her voice steady. If we don't announce her termination immediately, this will consume us. The CEO pinched the bridge of his nose. We also have to admit we ignored prior complaints. That is far worse. We have no choice, she replied. It's already out. Employees are leaking documents. If we don't get ahead of it, we'll lose control of the narrative entirely. Control. The word echoed through the room like a hollow bell. For years, they had been able to bury such complaints under layers of bureaucracy. This time, there was no burying it. Millions had already seen the truth. Back in row 12, Maya opened a news app and froze. There on the screen was a headline in bold letters: Flight attendant removed after racial profiling incident. Her breath caught. She nudged Ethan, showing him the screen. He stared at the words, his chest tight. It was happening faster than they had imagined. The reckoning was already underway, even before the plane touched down. Jordan refreshed his feed, his eyes widening. Civil rights attorneys were already offering to represent the Parkers. One name stood out, Anthony Brooks, known for high-profile cases that had reshaped policy. Jordan's pulse quickened. This was bigger than a viral video now. This was the start of something heavier, something that could shift the industry itself. Ethan turned toward Maya, his voice low. If this becomes legal, if we fight, are we ready? She looked into his eyes, her own steady despite the exhaustion. We don't have a choice. If we don't push back, nothing changes. We'll just be another headline that fades by morning. Ethan swallowed hard, his resolve settling in like a weight he could no longer avoid. He had never wanted to be a symbol, but maybe, this time, he didn't get to choose. Far below them, on late-night talk shows, comedians cracked jokes that weren't really jokes at all. Imagine being treated like a terrorist for reading the safety card too carefully. Laughter rippled through audiences, but beneath it lingered the sting of truth. In a small motel room hours away, Claire's husband watched the footage on television. His phone buzzed with calls. He didn't answer. He ran his hands over his face, the heaviness of shame settling in. He thought of his wife, trapped in the sky, the world already turning against her. He wondered if their marriage would survive the fallout. On the plane, Claire remained silent, her eyes fixed on the galley counter. She knew her career was ending, but the true weight of what she had done was only beginning to sink in. She had reduced 2 human beings to suspicion, and in doing so, she had unraveled not just their peace, but her own future. Ethan and Maya sat in silence, fingers intertwined, as the plane cut closer to Atlanta. Outside, the city lights twinkled, unaware of the storm about to descend upon the terminal. Inside, the Parkers knew nothing would ever feel ordinary again. They were no longer just passengers. They were unwilling symbols in a battle the world refused to stop fighting. And as the media storm raged below, They braced themselves for the landing, for the flashing cameras, for the questions that would follow them into tomorrow and beyond. The captain's voice broke through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Atlanta. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." The words were routine, but for Ethan and Maya Parker, they carried the weight of inevitability. They exchanged a glance, both understanding without speaking. The storm that had started in row 12 was about to follow them onto the ground. Maya slid her phone into her purse, her hands trembling slightly. Notifications were still flashing across the lock screen, but she could not bear to look any more. Ethan tightened his grip on the armrest, staring straight ahead. He could see the reflection of his own face in the darkened window, a face that looked more tired than he felt he had a right to be. Around them, passengers shuffled, stowing devices and adjusting seats, but the atmosphere remained tense. Some tried to avoid looking at the couple, while others stole glances, their expressions unreadable. Ethan could feel the weight of every eye, even those that pretended not to notice. In the galley, Claire Mitchell stood frozen. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority and professionalism, now felt like a costume she had no right to wear. The captain's words still rang in her ears. "When we land, you are off this flight." She had spent 12 years in the skies, but tonight she felt as though the floor beneath her feet was crumbling. The plane descended through a blanket of clouds, the turbulence mailed but enough to jostle the cabin. Maya reached for Ethan's hand instinctively, and he let her take it. Neither spoke. Both knew the hardest part was still to come. In the cockpit, Captain William Harris communicated with ground control. His instructions were precise, his tone steady, but his mind was not entirely on the landing. He had flown into Atlanta hundreds of times, but never under such scrutiny. He knew reporters were already gathering at the terminal. He knew corporate executives were bracing for impact as surely as the aircraft itself was. The city lights spread out beneath them, a glittering sprawl that seemed almost indifferent to the turmoil inside the aircraft. As the wheels lowered, Ethan felt his heart quicken. He had always loved the moment of landing, the thump of tires reconnecting with Earth. But now it felt like the start of a trial. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling across the runway before slowing to a steady crawl. Passengers clapped softly, an old tradition that felt hollow tonight. The cabin lights brightened, and the spell of silence broke with the sound of seatbelts clicking open. Maya leaned toward Ethan. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. He exhaled. "No, but I don't think we can be." Jordan Lee, across the aisle, angled his phone discreetly, already streaming the arrival. He knew people were waiting. He could see the comments scroll across his screen in real time. Are they okay? Is the airline going to apologize? We're watching. The world had not looked away, and Jordan was determined it would not. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Claire shifted uncomfortably, pressing her palms against the counter to steady herself. Her phone buzzed again, a flood of messages she could not bring herself to read. She imagined the terminal ahead, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions she had no answers for. She closed her eyes briefly, wishing she could disappear into the hum of the engines. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers stood quickly, retrieving bags from overhead bins. The Parkers remained seated, waiting, though they knew waiting would not shield them. Ethan's chest tightened as he heard a child whisper, "Is that them?" His eyes flicked toward the aisle, but quickly looked away. The door opened, and the sound of the jet bridge attaching echoed through the cabin. A flight attendant other than Claire stood by, forcing a smile as she wished passengers good night. One by one, they filed out, some pausing to glance at Ethan and Maya. When their row finally rose, Maya smoothed her sweater, inhaling deeply before stepping into the aisle. Ethan followed, his shoulders squared though his pulse raced. Jordan stayed close behind them, phone still recording. The jet bridge was buzzing before they even stepped onto it. Voices carried down the tunnel, urgent and overlapping. As they emerged, the glare of camera flashes assaulted them. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended like weapons. Questions flew at them from every angle. Ethan, how did it feel to be singled out? Maya, do you think this was racial profiling? Do you plan to sue the airline? The couple froze momentarily under the onslaught. Maya squeezed Ethan's hand, and he steadied himself, his voice low but firm. We were humiliated. We were treated like criminals for no reason. That should never happen to anyone. The words rippled through the crowd. More questions followed, louder this time. Security officers stepped in, creating a small path through the chaos. Cameras continued flashing, recording every step, every flicker of expression. Claire emerged minutes later, her head down, flanked by supervisors. The reporters turned on her instantly. Claire, do you regret your actions? Did you target them because they are black? Are you aware of prior complaints? Her mouth opened, but no words came. The supervisors guided her quickly past the crowd, their expressions grim. She felt the weight of every flash, every shouted word, pressing her deeper into silence. Ethan and Maya reached the terminal, where even more cameras waited. Screens above their heads played the very video that had changed everything, looping endlessly. Travelers paused mid-stride to watch, their faces reflecting shock, sympathy, or judgment. The couple walked through it all, their dignity intact, though their hearts pounded. Jordan caught up with them, lowering his phone just long enough to whisper, "You're not alone. People are with you." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Ethan gave Jordan a brief, grateful look. Outside the terminal, black SUVs waited. The airline had arranged transportation, though it felt less like courtesy and more like containment. Security ushered the Parkers inside, shielding them from the last of the cameras. Inside the vehicle, the silence was thick. Maya leaned her head against the seat, closing her eyes. It's just starting, isn't it? Ethan stared out the tinted window, watching the blur of lights. Yeah, this is just the beginning. Back in the airport office, Claire sat across from her supervisor and an HR representative. Her uniform blazer was folded neatly on the chair beside her, though she felt stripped of authority already. The HR representative spoke plainly. You are suspended effective immediately, pending termination review. We will contact you with next steps. Claire nodded numbly, her throat dry. She wanted to argue, to plead, but the words never came. She realized in that moment that whatever defense she had imagined was gone. The world had already decided. At a hotel across the city, executives huddled in another late-night emergency meeting. The CEO's voice was low but urgent. We need to get ahead of this. A public apology, immediate termination, and a commitment to systemic reform. Otherwise, we are finished. Advisors murmured agreement. Lawyers prepared drafts of statements. But no matter how polished the words, they knew the power no longer rested with them. It rested with the couple who had been humiliated and with the millions who had witnessed it. Back in the SUV, Ethan reached for Maya's hand. She intertwined her fingers with his, leaning into the quiet strength of his presence. The world outside spun with chaos, but inside, for just a moment, they were together, steady in the storm. The plane had landed, the cameras had captured, the questions had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Parkers woke the next morning to a city that already knew their names. Ethan sat at the edge of the hotel bed, phone in hand, scrolling through endless notifications. Headlines blazed across every news site. Humiliation in row 12. Black couple targeted on flight 287. His picture and Maya's were everywhere, frozen in the glow of the viral clip. Maya stirred beside him, blinking against the daylight spilling through the curtains. "What time is it?" she asked groggily. 6:30, Ethan murmured. "We barely slept." She sat up, rubbing her temples. "We will not get through this alone." There was a knock at the door. Ethan rose, tension coiling in his chest. When he opened it, a man in a dark suit stood there, briefcase in hand. His presence carried authority, but not in an intimidating way. Ethan Parker, Maya Parker. His voice was deep, calm. "My name is Anthony Brooks. I am a civil rights attorney. I believe you need representation." Maya glanced at Ethan, then back at the man. "How did you find us?" Anthony gave a faint smile. "The world found you. I simply followed." They let him in. The three sat around a small table, the silence broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside the hotel window. Anthony opened his briefcase, laying out folders already thick with printouts. "You have a strong case," he began. "This was public humiliation, carried out without cause, and recorded in a way no one can dispute. The airline failed to act on prior complaints about the attendant involved. That makes them liable not only for what happened to you, but for a systemic pattern." Ethan leaned back, his arms crossed, wary. "And if we do nothing," Anthony met his eyes steadily, "then the airline issues a polished apology, promises training, and quietly continues with business as usual. Claire Mitchell fades into obscurity, and nothing changes. You go back to work, but this scar stays with you. And the next couple in row 12 will face the same humiliation." Maya's throat tightened. "So what happens if we fight?" Anthony leaned forward, his voice deliberate. "We push for a lawsuit that forces systemic accountability. We demand damages for the humiliation you endured, but more importantly, we insist on policy reform that protects passengers of color from being profiled and publicly shamed. We set precedent. We make sure this cannot be swept under the rug." Ethan rubbed his face, torn between weariness and anger. "I did not ask for any of this. We just wanted to fly to see family." Anthony's expression softened. "No one asks for it. But sometimes history chooses people who did not volunteer. The question is whether you let the moment define you, or whether you define it." The words hung in the air. Maya reached for Ethan's hand, her voice steady despite the quiver in her chest. "I think we fight." Ethan looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, and finally nodded. "Then we fight." Anthony opened a folder and slid documents across the table. "Then we begin. The first step is filing a formal complaint against the airline. We will gather witness statements, including from Jordan Lee, whose video has already become central. We will compile evidence of prior complaints against Claire Mitchell and show the airline's failure to act. Once we file, the lawsuit becomes public record, and the pressure will mount." Maya exhaled slowly, bracing herself. "And what about the backlash? We have already received threats." Anthony's face darkened. "That will continue. Some will call you heroes. Others will call you troublemakers. But I assure you, the law is on your side." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. "Then let's do it. Later that day." The three of them sat in Anthony's office downtown. Jordan Lee arrived with his phone still buzzing from constant notifications. He looked both exhausted and energized. "I am with you," he told the Parkers. "The video is undeniable. No one can twist this into something it is not." Anthony nodded. "We will need your testimony." "Are you prepared for that?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "I have been prepared since the moment I hit record." They spent hours piecing together the timeline, collecting statements, assembling documents that revealed the airline's negligence. The office was filled with the quiet urgency of purpose. For the first time since the incident, Ethan felt a flicker of control returning. Meanwhile, across the city, executives at the airline sat in tense meetings. The CEO's voice was sharp. "They have filed suit. It will not go away quietly. If we settle, we admit guilt. If we fight, we risk a trial that could expose every complaint we have ever buried." An advisor leaned forward. "We cannot afford discovery. If the court forces us to release internal documents, it will be catastrophic." The CEO slammed his hand on the table. "Then what do you suggest?" The room was silent, the weight of consequence pressing down like gravity. Finally, the head of legal spoke. "We try to settle quickly, before this gains even more momentum. Offer them money, enough to walk away." Back in Anthony's office, the Parkers listened as he explained the next steps. "They will likely try to buy you off. The amount may be tempting, but remember, money cannot erase what happened. If you accept quietly, they will move on unchanged. If you refuse, you will endure more pain. But you may win change not just for yourselves, but for others." Ethan's chest tightened. He thought of his career, the whispers already spreading among his colleagues. He thought of Maya, already receiving hateful messages online. He thought of their family, who wanted only peace. But then he thought of the look in Maya's eyes on the plane, the steel beneath the pain. "We refuse," he said at last. Maya squeezed his hand. "We push." Anthony allowed himself the faintest smile. "Then prepare. The trial will be brutal. But if we succeed, it will be historic." The first press conference took place outside the courthouse. Microphones clustered together, cameras flashing. Ethan stepped up to the podium, his voice steady though his hands shook slightly at his sides. "What happened to us was not a misunderstanding. It was not a mistake. It was discrimination. And it is not just our story. It is the story of too many passengers who have been profiled, silenced, and humiliated simply for existing. We are here to say, enough. We are here to demand accountability, not just for us, but for everyone who deserves to fly without fear." Maya stood beside him, her eyes fierce. "We do not want apologies. We want change. We want to make sure no one else has to sit in a seat and feel like a criminal for being who they are. This lawsuit is not just about us. It is about justice." The crowd erupted in questions, but the message was already clear. This was bigger than two passengers. This was a battle that had finally found its voice. Back at the airline headquarters, executives watched the broadcast in silence. The CEO muttered under his breath, "We are no longer fighting two people. We are fighting a movement." And in that moment, the Parkers knew the lawsuit was not just a legal matter. It was a turning point, a line drawn in the sand. They had chosen to fight, and there was no turning back. The courtroom was colder than Ethan Parker expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. High ceilings, Dark wood panels and the quiet shuffle of lawyers adjusting their files created a sense of gravity that weighed on him as he and Maya took their seats behind Anthony Brooks. The hum of whispered conversations filled the room, but when the judge entered, silence swept across like a tide pulling everything into order. Ethan glanced at Maya. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but her eyes were unyielding. He could see the same determination that had carried them through the chaos at the airport, through the media storm, through the decision to fight rather than walk away. She caught his look and gave a small nod. Whatever happened here, they were in it together. Anthony leaned toward them, his voice low. "Stay calm. Let me carry this. Your strength will be in your composure." The judge's voice rang out, steady and authoritative. "In the matter of Parker versus Horizon Airways, we are here to hear arguments of racial discrimination and negligence." Across the aisle sat the airline's legal team, a polished group in expensive suits, led by a woman with sharp eyes named Margaret Kane. Her presence radiated confidence, but her expression betrayed tension. She knew the world was watching. Cameras were not allowed inside, but reporters packed the hallway, their pens ready to capture every word that leaked out. Anthony stood first. "Your Honor, my clients Ethan and Maya Parker were humiliated without cause, targeted solely because of how they looked. They were questioned like criminals in front of hundreds of passengers, their dignity stripped in an instant. This was not an isolated incident. It was the result of systemic negligence, an airline that ignored prior complaints about an employee who repeatedly profiled black passengers. The evidence will show a pattern. The evidence will show responsibility." Ethan felt a surge of heat rise in his chest at Anthony's words. Maya reached for his hand beneath the table, grounding him. Margaret Kane rose smoothly. "Your Honor, Horizon Airways does not condone discrimination. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Flight attendants are trained to err on the side of safety, and in this case, Ms. Mitchell acted in good faith. To claim systemic negligence is to exaggerate one human error into a sweeping indictment of an entire company." Anthony's jaw tightened, but he waited. The judge motioned for the first witness. Jordan Lee was called. He walked to the stand with steady steps, his phone in his hand, though it was powered off now. The oath was administered, and he sat, eyes unwavering. Anthony approached. "Mr. Lee, where were you seated on Flight 2011? "Across the aisle from the Parkers. Row 12. Jordan replied. "And what did you observe?" Jordan's voice was clear, resolute. "I saw two passengers sitting quietly, talking in low voices. I saw nothing suspicious. Then I saw two officers arrive, question them loudly, and treat them like criminals. And I saw Claire Mitchell watching, arms crossed, as if she had started it all. I recorded because I knew what I was witnessing was wrong." Anthony held up a printed still of the video. "Is this your recording?" "Yes." "And did you alter it in any way?" "No. What the world saw is exactly what happened." Margaret rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Lee, you are an activist, are you not? You often seek out moments that can go viral." Jordan met her gaze evenly. "I do not seek them. They happen, and when they do, I shine a light on them." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She moved on, but the damage was done. Jordan's testimony was steady, unshaken. Next came Claire Mitchell. She looked smaller than she had on the plane. Her shoulders hunched slightly as she sat at the stand. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he watched her. Maya's hand gripped his, but neither spoke. Anthony stepped forward. Ms. Mitchell, you reported the Parkers as suspicious. What was your reasoning? Claire's voice wavered. They were whispering. He kept looking at the safety card. I had a bad feeling. Anthony's eyebrow arched. A bad feeling. Did they break any rules? No. Did they make any threats? No. Did you see them handle any dangerous materials? No. Yet you involved security, leading to their public humiliation. And this was not the first time. Was it? Claire's face paled. I thought I was doing my job. Anthony's voice sharpened. Is it your job to repeatedly single out black passengers without evidence? Because we have 5 prior complaints tied to your name. 5. All ignored by the airline until this one went viral. Explain that. The courtroom stirred. Claire opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her silence was louder than any words could have been. Margaret quickly stood. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness. The judge's gavel struck. Overruled. Answer the question. Ms. Mitchell. Claire's eyes dropped to the table. I cannot. Anthony let the silence linger before returning to his seat. The proceedings stretched for hours. Witnesses came forward, some passengers describing the humiliation they had seen, others recounting how they themselves had been targeted in similar ways on past flights. Each testimony layered upon the last, building a picture not of one bad moment, but of a system that had looked the other way until the truth was too public to ignore. During breaks, Ethan and Maya sat quietly with Anthony, the weight of it all pressing down. Ethan's mind spun with doubt. What if the jury sided with the airline? What if they lost and all this pain led nowhere? Maya sensed his turmoil and leaned close. We are not alone. Look around. People are speaking because of us. Whatever the verdict, something has already shifted. He nodded, but inside he still battled the fear that justice would slip away as it so often did. By the second week of proceedings, the courtroom had become a battlefield. Margaret Kane argued fiercely that the airline could not be held accountable for one attendant's judgment call. Anthony countered with documents proving Horizon Airways had suppressed prior complaints. Internal emails showing supervisors dismissing concerns with phrases like, just doing her job and better safe than sorry. The jury listened, their expressions solemn. The judge kept order, but even he could not hide the heaviness that settled with each revelation. Finally, Anthony delivered his closing argument. He stood tall, his voice resonant, carrying the weight of history as much as the case at hand. What happened to Ethan and Maya Parker is not a misunderstanding. It is not about one bad judgment call. It is about a pattern that tells people like them they do not belong, that they are suspect simply for existing. The airline had the chance to stop this. They chose not to. Today, you have the chance to say no more, to say dignity cannot be stripped away on a hunch, to say justice matters. He paused, his eyes sweeping the jury. This case is bigger than 2 passengers. It is about who we are when we take to the skies. Do we choose fear, or do we choose fairness? Do we accept profiling, or do we demand dignity? The answer is in your hands. As he sat down, Maya felt tears prick her eyes. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip steady. The judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The courtroom emptied into hushed corridors where reporters swarmed, their questions echoing off marble walls. Ethan and Maya stepped outside into the flash of cameras, their faces calm, though their hearts raced. The trial had been fought. Now the verdict would decide not only their future, but the message carried far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The air inside the courthouse was thick with expectation. Every bench in the gallery was filled, every corner occupied by reporters scribbling notes, and every hallway outside clogged with cameras waiting to pounce. Ethan and Maya Parker sat side by side, their fingers entwined, as the jury filed back into the room. Neither of them had spoken much since the deliberations began. The hours had dragged, stretching like an eternity. Maya had stared out a window in the waiting room, her thoughts drifting between anger and fear. Ethan had paced in circles, repeating the same question under his breath. Would justice finally be done, or would this moment slip away like so many others before it? Anthony Brooks leaned forward, whispering just loud enough for them to hear. Whatever happens, you have already changed the conversation. Remember that. Ethan nodded, though his chest still felt tight. Maya squeezed his hand, her touch steady, grounding him in the storm. The judge entered, his robe swaying with authority. Please rise. Everyone stood as the jury settled into their seats. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind but firm eyes, clutched a folded paper in her hands. Ethan felt his heartbeat thunder against his ribs. The silence was unbearable. The judge's voice was calm but carried through the chamber. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she replied. The bailiff took the paper, passing it to the judge, who unfolded it slowly, as if the weight of the words required reverence. He read silently for a moment before returning his gaze to the courtroom. In the matter of Parker versus Horizon Airways, he began, the court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Maya clutched Ethan's hand so tightly he almost winced, but he did not care. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. The judge continued, his voice firm. Horizon Airways is ordered to pay damages to Ethan and Maya Parker. Furthermore, the airline is required to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff, establish an independent review board for passenger complaints, and revise internal policies to prevent racial profiling. The words struck like a bell, reverberating across the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Anthony Brooks closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling relief. Ethan bowed his head, overwhelmed, while Maya covered her mouth with her free hand, unable to hold back her sobs of release. The judge's gavel fell. Court is adjourned. The room erupted. Some in the gallery cheered. Others cried, and still others simply shook their heads, stunned by the magnitude of what had just been declared. Anthony turned to the Parkers, his voice steady but warm. You did it, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who will come after you. Ethan swallowed hard, emotion clogging his throat. We did not want to be heroes. We just wanted to be seen as human. Anthony placed a hand on his shoulder. And that is why this matters. As they stepped out into the hallway, the sound was deafening. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, cameras flashing so brightly Ethan had to squint. Voices overlapped in a cacophony. Maya, how do you feel about the verdict, Ethan? What do you say to other passengers of color who have been through similar experiences? Do you believe this ruling will change the airline industry? Maya steadied herself, then spoke clearly, her voice carrying above the chaos. This is not just about us. This is about every person who has been told they do not belong. This is about dignity. And today, the court reminded us that dignity is not optional. It is a right, Ethan added, his voice firm, though his heart raced. We hope this verdict sends a message that no company can ignore complaints. No employee can act on bias without consequence. and no passenger should feel like a criminal for simply boarding a flight. Change is not just possible, it is necessary. The crowd erupted again, the cameras capturing every word, every tear glistening on Maya's cheek, every tremor of determination in Ethan's voice. Across town, at Horizon Airways headquarters, executives watched the live coverage in silence. The CEO sat at the head of the table, his face pale. "We lost," he said simply. An advisor tried to speak, but the CEO raised a hand. "No excuses. We are no longer dealing with one lawsuit. We are dealing with a precedent. Every case we ignored, every complaint we brushed aside, will now come back to us, and the world will be watching." Claire Mitchell watched too, from a small motel room where the blinds were drawn tight. She sat hunched on the edge of the bed, the television casting harsh light across her face. As the verdict played out, she felt the finality of it settle into her bones. It was over. Whatever defense she had clung to, whatever insistence that she had just been doing her job, was drowned out by the truth the jury had spoken. For the Parkers, leaving the courthouse was like walking into history. Supporters lined the steps, holding signs that read "Justice for the Parkers," "End racial profiling," and "Flying while black should not be a crime." The chants grew louder as Ethan and Maya emerged, flanked by Anthony Brooks. "Justice for the Parkers. Justice for the Parkers." Maya's chest swelled with emotion. She had not expected this, had not dared to imagine such an outpouring. Ethan lifted her hand high. Their fingers entwined, and the crowd roared even louder. For the first time since the nightmare began, Ethan felt the crushing weight in his chest begin to lift, not because the fight was over, but because they had proven it could be fought. That evening, they sat together in their hotel room, the noise of the city buzzing faintly beyond the glass. Maya curled against Ethan, her head on his shoulder. "Do you think it will really change things?" she asked softly. Ethan stared out at the skyline, the lights blinking like distant stars. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe it is enough that we tried. Maybe it is enough that we did not stay silent." Maya tilted her head to look at him. "It feels bigger than us now, like we lit a fire we cannot control." He kissed the top of her head, holding her close, then let it burn. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside their room, the Parkers finally allowed themselves a moment of quiet, a moment to breathe, a moment to feel that after all the humiliation, the pain, and the fear, justice had spoken, and it had spoken their names. Weeks passed, but the echo of the verdict refused to fade. The case of Ethan and Maya Parker against Horizon Airways had become more than a legal battle. It had become a cultural landmark, a reference point that journalists, scholars, and everyday travelers invoked when speaking about justice and dignity in the skies. For Ethan and Maya, life did not return to normal. It could not. They still went to work, still visited family, still walked through grocery store aisles and city streets. But everywhere they went, people recognized them. Some stopped to thank them. Others simply nodded in quiet respect. And sometimes there were those who muttered words filled with resentment, accusing them of tearing down an airline or ruining a woman's life. Maya felt the sting of those whispers, but she also felt the weight of the letters arriving daily. Handwritten notes from strangers who had once been humiliated on planes, buses, or in stores, thanking her and Ethan for refusing to stay silent. Parents who wrote that their children would know a different world because of what the Parkers had done. The gratitude outweighed the hate, though the balance was never easy. Ethan found himself reflecting in moments of stillness. He would sit by the window at night, city lights stretching endlessly, and wonder how two people who only wanted a quiet flight to see family had ended up here. He thought of the humiliation on the plane, the heat in his chest as officers questioned him like a criminal, and the way passengers had stared. He thought of how small he had felt. Then he thought of the courthouse, the chants on the steps, the signs declaring their names in bold letters, and he realized something had shifted inside him. He had discovered a strength he had not known he carried. Claire Mitchell had disappeared from public life. After the trial, she retreated from the city, her career in ruins, her reputation shredded. For weeks she had fought back in interviews and online posts, insisting she had been misunderstood, insisting she was not a racist. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that her words only widened the distance between her and the truth. Eventually she fell silent, swallowed by the very storm she had helped create. Horizon Airways scrambled to rebuild. Their board announced sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-discrimination training, new accountability measures, and a public partnership with advocacy groups. The CEO delivered an apology that aired across major networks, his voice measured, his eyes heavy with contrition. Yet many wondered whether the reforms were born from sincerity or from fear of losing everything. For passengers, the question lingered every time they stepped onto a Horizon flight. Had the culture really changed? Or had it merely adapted to survive one evening, months after the verdict? Ethan and Maya found themselves back at an airport, a different airline this time, a different destination. As they walked through the terminal, Ethan felt his chest tighten. Memories came rushing back, uninvited. The officers demanding identification, the whispers, the humiliation that clung to him like a shadow. Maya noticed the tension in his shoulders. She touched his arm gently. "We are okay," she said softly. "This is not that day." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I know, but part of me still waits for it to happen again." As they waited at the gate, a young flight attendant approached them. She was no older than 25, her expression hesitant but sincere. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," she said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did, what you fought for, it mattered. It changed things. I became a flight attendant because I wanted to serve people with respect. And because of you, I believe I can." Maya's throat tightened. She managed a small smile. "Thank you for saying that." The woman nodded, her eyes shining, before returning to her duties. Ethan turned to Maya, his chest easing for the first time since they entered the airport. "Maybe we did do enough," he said quietly. Maya leaned against him. "We did what we could. And sometimes that has to be enough." Their flight boarded without incident. No stares, no interruptions, no humiliation. Just the ordinary rhythm of passengers finding their seats, luggage sliding into overhead bins, and the quiet anticipations of travel. For the Parkers, the ordinary felt extraordinary. Months later, they stood once again in front of cameras, this time by choice. At a press conference in a modest community center, they announced the launch of the Parker Initiative, a foundation dedicated to fighting racial profiling in travel and ensuring accountability in customer service industries. Backed by donations from supporters and legal partners, the initiative pledged to fund research, training, and advocacy. Maya spoke first, her voice steady but warm. "We never imagined our lives would take this path. But when we were humiliated on that flight, when we were told by silence and stares that we did not belong, we made a choice, We chose to fight, not only for ourselves, but for everyone who has ever been told they are less. The Parker Initiative is about dignity. Dignity in the skies, on the ground, everywhere. Ethan added, his eyes sweeping the crowd. Justice is not one moment. It is not one verdict. It is a practice, a daily act. This initiative is our way of making sure the fight continues. Because until no one has to fear being profiled, until no one has to feel like a suspect simply for existing, our work is not done. The applause that followed was not as loud as the chants on courthouse steps, but it carried a different weight. It was the sound of people believing change was possible. Later that night, back in their apartment, Ethan and Maya sat together in the quiet. The city hummed outside, but within their walls, peace settled for a moment. Ethan turned to Maya, his voice soft. Do you ever regret it? Taking this fight on, Maya thought for a long moment before answering. I regret what we went through. I regret the pain. But I do not regret standing up, because if we had stayed silent, nothing would have changed, and silence would have broken me more than the humiliation ever did. Ethan nodded, pulling her close. Then I regret nothing. The world would move on. New headlines would take over. New scandals would demand attention. But for Ethan and Maya, the story of what happened in row 12 would never fade. It was etched into their lives. A scar, but also a symbol. It was proof that dignity could be defended, that voices could rise against silence, that even the smallest act of resistance could ripple outward and become something larger. And as they drifted into sleep, hand in hand, they knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a legacy built not from anger alone, but from courage, resilience, and the unyielding belief that justice was possible. As the plane touched down, and later, as the gavel struck in the courtroom, one truth became undeniable. Ethan and Maya Parker had turned humiliation into history. Their courage forced an industry to confront its blind spots. Their voices spoke not just for themselves, but for every passenger who has ever felt invisible, profiled, or unworthy of respect. This story reminds us that dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. And when that right is denied, silence is complicity. Ethan and Maya chose not to stay silent. They chose to fight, even when the odds felt impossible, even when the weight of public scrutiny threatened to break them. But the story does not end with a verdict. It continues in every flight attendant's briefing, every passenger's boarding experience, every policy rewritten because two ordinary people decided that enough was enough. Their legacy as a reminder change begins the moment someone dares to demand it. So as we close this chapter, ask yourself, what would you do if it were you in seat 12? Would you bow your head, or would you rise if this story moved you? Let it move others too. Like, share, and subscribe, so together we can keep these conversations alive and be ready for the next story that will challenge us all.